I might start by telling you how I got into this, how I got into researching scientists as writers, because it starts with my teaching. So I have been teaching first-year science students a big first-year writing course for about 20 years. And my students are unifiedly horrified by this, okay? They have spent most of their secondary school years trying to avoid writing-rich subjects. They dropped English and history as early as they could because they hate writing so much. And then they arrive for their first day of their BSc or whatever it is, and 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the first person they encounter is me, and I'm an English teacher. It's like, ugh. And any amount of assurance that what I'm going to be teaching them is going to be stuff that's relevant to their degree and relevant to their careers falls almost entirely on deaf ears. They are convinced, A, that writing has nothing to do with science, and B, this is the best bit, that if they do ever get to be senior scientists, they'll have secretaries and they'll do the writing for them. I think they must have come back from the 1950s, you know. I just can't quite understand how that works. By the time I meet these students again as graduate students, they do understand that there is a connection between writing and science. They've got that. But they're convinced that they can't do it. All right? So they've gone from complete denial to a sense of serious gloom. All right? And the first thing that I do with them is I send them out to shadow a senior scientist in their own field, and then to interview them about what they think about writing and communication and how it connects with their career. They come back astonished. The first time this happened, the first time I tried this experiment, I was astonished too. Now I'm used to it. What they report to me is all the senior scientists they shadowed and then interviewed told them that they spend over 80% of their time either writing or engaged in some form of communication. Many of them say 100% of the time. This convinces the students that this is important. The other thing I think that has influenced me is that although I work in a School of English and Media Studies, I spend most of my time and all of my teaching in the College of Sciences. And so over the years, I've had multiple conversations with scientists about their writing. And I have been astonished by the sophistication of their approach to writing and their passion for it and how much they engage with it. And the question for me always as a teacher is, how do I get them from the first year to the graduate to the very sophisticated writers that they need to be when they become research scientists? But there's another kind of little part of this introduction that I think is important, and certainly was important for me in terms of taking on this research and thinking about it in terms of teaching. So a few years ago, I went off to a conference in the States called Writing Research Across Borders. It is the only big international research-focused writing conference. And I was very excited. There was a collection of papers about science writing. And I sat through one paper after another, which basically showed that scientists don't know how to do argumentation. And I was really puzzled by this. And the other thing that really struck me was that after each of these papers, the conversation degenerated into a discussion about what terrible writers scientists were, how they were impenetrable, how they hated writing, and how they all needed remedial help. And it was like, I just don't see how this connects with what I'm hearing from the scientists out there. So I started this research looking at scientists as writers as a way primarily of informing my teaching, but also other people's teaching about how scientists think about writing. So, my driving question, how do I get my students, how do you get your students from the reluctant writers to the sophisticated writers that they need to be? And so I'm going to start today by looking at my research. So how I went about my research, what are the key things that have come out in terms of their relevance to teaching? And then I'm going to talk about the implications for the writing classroom when we're addressing science students. That's a lengthy introduction. I hope it will find your way into this topic. So, one of the first things that I have to tell you is that scientists' voices are almost entirely missing from the literature about writing, and including the literature about science writing. And I sometimes, in my darkest moment, think that they are something like a forgotten tribe of academic writers. That, that writing teachers are like anthropologists. We stand there observing the village from a distance and examining their artifacts. So, looking at the texts that they write in the form of the rhetoric of science. And sometimes we get a little bit closer. So like the anthropologists who actually visit the tribal village, we might get as far as the lab to observe and document their processes. But what we have never done, as far as I can see, is ask them, what do you think about writing? So we know very little about how scientists think. We've constructed an industry of teaching others how to imitate scientists' textual practices, but we know very little about their practices because we don't ask them. And we know even less about their thinking, their perceptions, their attitudes, and their beliefs. And I think this really matters. There's some interesting research that's been done by Dalber and Sandberg, which shows that experts their beliefs when they are novices will determine whether they are likely to become experts or not. So we need to know what are the beliefs of scientists around writing, what do they feel about writing, and how have they grown as writers for us to be able to bring this into the classroom. In my even darker moments, I think that rather than being anthropologists, we are more like missionaries out to colonize and advise the natives on how they should go about their practice. My observation is that senior faculty are amongst the most sophisticated writers in the academy, often writing for a wider range of audiences, their immediate disciplinary peers, peers in adjacent fields, a broad scientific audience, and a range of public audiences, including social media. So they're engaged with a wider range of writing than any other faculty member. And since their writing processes are often very collaborative and hierarchical and multidisciplinary, their writing practices are also very socially complex, which is something that so far we have not been replicating in our classroom. So how to account for this discrepancy? And one of the questions I have is, are we engaged in the cultural appropriation of science writing and the experience of writing science? In the context in which I work, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the indigenous people, the Tangata Whenua, the Maori people, are very cautious about Pākehā New Zealanders, they're Western New Zealanders, speaking about or interpreting Maori culture. The Maori, like indigenous people elsewhere, see their culture as a teanga or a treasure, and only those in possession of the treasure are able to talk about it. Anything else is cultural appropriation. Yet it has seemed to me at times that we in the humanities, who consider writing and rhetoric and composition to be our own field, have no such qualms about the cultural appropriation of scientific writing and the experience of writing science. And while this really matters to me as a researcher, it matters to me more as a teacher. I don't want to be engaged in this kind of process. And I think hearing scientists' voices and engaging with them really matters for our students. First of all, it really matters for our undergraduates. A lot of them have as their literacy aim joining a scientific community of writers. And so we owe it to them to have authentic processes that will lead them as apprentices into scientific writing. I think also in many writing classrooms, and I've just described my own, there is some skepticism around whether somebody who's trained in the humanities is actually able to be the gatekeeper for people moving into scientific writing. And indeed, if we know nothing about the language and processes and practices of science writing, how can we be authentic? How can we be credible as teachers of science writing? There have been movements to change the humanities domination of teaching of writing. So the writing in the disciplines movement and the writing across the curriculum movement in the States have been really important in terms of bringing scientists into the writing classroom to give an authentic experience of what it means to teach writing. However, the thing about this is that when students see a professor of chemistry or a professor of biology come into the classroom to teach writing, all they see is the successful present. They don't understand how that scientist got to that place. They don't even know maybe that this scientist who is so successful as a writer was a terrible writer as an 18-year-old. And so we need to find a way of capturing that information if we're going to really speak to students. It also matters for our graduates who are beginning their apprenticeship into scientific writing. I'll just let you read this for a second. What I'd like to focus on is that none of these methods is designed to help learners to acquire the kind of knowledge about language that might enable them to be aware of what they might achieve by choosing to write in different ways. So this is an issue for graduate students. There's been research that shows that if you follow the instructions given by journals in terms of how they want something written, you are likely to miss the mark, because actually the way people write for journals is different to how they are instructed in the journal instructions. So the kinds of resources that might be there to help graduate students are not really very helpful. So instead, the novice writer relies on imitation, peers, and co-authors, many of whom, because they learnt to write intuitively, are not able to articulate their own processes. So for most graduate students, becoming a writer of science is a matter of hit and miss. You try something out, your advisor says, no, that's terrible, do it again. Or else they scribble all over it and rewrite it and say, do the rest like that. And somehow you have to work out what that means. And a lot of our students do find out what that means, but they can't explain it because nobody's explained it to them. Finally, I think hearing these voices matters to us as teachers, because our credibility absolutely depends on us having this authentic experience of teaching of writing. If we don't know how scientists write, the context in which they write, and what the scientific community as a whole believes and thinks about writing, how can we teach this curriculum with any credibility? So an example of this is that as writing teachers, we're very aware of issues around, say, process writing. But can we assume that writing process in the humanities is the same as process writing in the sciences? As I talked to scientists, I began to doubt this. So what I have engaged with in my research is I have looked at, I've been around the world interviewing scientists about their experience as writers. So I've looked at senior scientists, emerging scientists, PhDs. I have also interviewed a few undergraduates to get their perspective. So I've interviewed people in New Zealand, Australia, the US and the UK. They come from a range of scientific disciplines collected over 4 years. You'll notice that in that group of countries, that are all Western countries, I decided that the experience of people for whom English was a second language was probably a second book, because the issues would be a lot broader. And I used a survey and a semi-structured interview to develop these narratives. It's been an amazing experience, and I have sat in the offices of some pretty amazing people. Here is the theoretical framework with which I've engaged with this research. So first of all, the literature on scientific writing and scientists' views, beliefs and experiences as writers. Now, the quick answer in terms of how much literature is there about scientists as writers is almost none, all right? There is one study of mathematicians' beliefs and attitudes of writers, and there are 4 studies by Canadian authors led by Larry Ure, but they looked at an extremely small sample, and they didn't differentiate between different levels of seniority, so there are some limitations. However, what they did find was this. So Ure and his associates suggest that scientists write primarily for peers within their disciplines, that they rarely cross boundaries into writing for a more general audience or for across disciplines, that they see the purpose of writing as knowledge reporting, they are unlikely to directly understand scientific writing as persuasive, but they are emotionally engaged with their writing and continually driven to extend the knowledge in their fields. Okay? Because there was so little literature on this topic, I also went to the literature on productive academic writers. So the literature here suggests the following: that successful academic writers are not anxious about writing, that they enjoy and are energized by writing, that they gain a sense of personal accomplishment and dedication through writing, and 2 other things that you will know if you are writers yourself. They are resilient, so they can take a knockback. Anybody who's been through the peer review process knows what that feels like. And they are confident. But the major literature that I have used in looking at this, because still I had too little literature to deal with, was the literature on expertise. And this has been a very fruitful thing. And in terms of thinking about our own students moving towards expertise, I think we have a lot to learn from the literature here. So, the literature on expertise. Dreyfus and Dreyfus are one of the key people in this field, and they have several steps to expertise. So what they showed was that experts show specific attitudes to their work. They are engaged and emotionally invested. Their practice is based on a tacit understanding of context, practice, and discipline. They are able to engage both analytically and intuitively with a situation depending on their experience, their broad experience. And an individual's belief about the nature and purpose of their practice may support or limit their accomplishment of expertise. Right, so Dreyfus and Dreyfus were important here. Patricia Alexander has a model of expertise that is more geared towards academic expertise. And she suggests that experts fit the following characteristics. They have a broader, more structured understanding of the big picture of a domain. They have deeper affective investment. They contribute to new knowledge. They have an understanding of the methodologies of the domain. They engage in problem finding by posing questions that push the boundaries of the domain. And they cannot stop their engagement if they wish to retain expert status. As well as these 2, I looked at, you may know, Barita and Scardamalia's book on expertise, and they suggest that experts must emerge from a learning community, and I'm going to come back to this towards the end. And finally, Holyoake suggests there are 2 kinds of experts. Routine experts who do the same thing over and over again perfectly, and adaptive experts who are able to use present knowledge to engage with new situations. So, that's the theoretical background. I'm going to skip over the next slide, I think, except briefly to tell you that what I developed was something called the life cycle of the scientific writer, and proposed that there are 4 stages in the development of a scientific writer. That there is learning to write, which starts in primary school, elementary school, and goes through to the end of the degree of an undergraduate degree. And then learning to write science, which starts in postgraduate years, goes past the PhD and maybe up to 7 years out of the PhD. And then there is what I've called a leader of science writing, where somebody is less likely to be engaged in their own writing and more likely to be supporting other people's writing. And then a final stage, which at this stage I've called the end of career writer, which is where somebody is close to retirement and they think, right, I want to have an impact on a broader audience. And so they start to write for a wider range of people. Now, I won't go into the detail of this, but what I've suggested is that there are different affects and different attitudes to writing at each of those stages, and that each of those stages has different kinds of writing associated with it. So, what did I find? These are my key questions. What writing tasks are scientists engaged with? Are they adaptive or routine experts? My hypothesis was that most of them were actually adaptive experts who could write in a range of contexts. I wanted to see whether there was support for the idea of the life cycle of the scientific writer, and what evidence there was that the learning community was a critical aspect in terms of helping people to become expert science writers. Now, the interesting thing about this research is that all the people that I interviewed were experts in their fields. But what I wanted to know was, were they experts as writers? And what kinds of experts were they? And that's quite a subtle difference in terms of interviewing, I can tell you. But what I want to do today is not necessarily go through all this research. I want to think about the implications for the classroom. So these are the questions that I think should concern us as educators. First of all, what is the place of writing in science? Can we establish how much it matters? What are the attitudes and beliefs prevalent in expert science writers? Because we need to think about how we might develop those attitudes and beliefs in our own students. What does scientific writing process look like? And what is the range of genres that scientists engage with? Because if we're going to be teaching writing, we need to know how flexible our students need to be. And finally, what will constitute an effective learning environment for scientists as writers? All right, here are my findings in terms of those questions in relation to teaching. First of all, successful scientists do indeed write all the time. The more senior the scientist, the more time they spend writing. Okay? If you think about emerging scientists, they are likely to spend a lot of time in the lab or out in the field doing research. The senior scientist is less likely to be spending time doing that, and is likely to be spending most of their time either writing and communicating themselves or engaging with other people's writing, and in fact modeling the teaching of writing. So, the more senior the scientists, the more time they spend writing, and what and how they write changes over time. So one of the things that really did come across for me was that our students need to develop highly flexible writing skills and to be able to understand a rhetorical context so that they can write in a range of contexts. Also, scientists engage with multiple writing tasks simultaneously. So they are unlikely to have one thing they're writing on and be working just on that. Most of them had at least 8 writing tasks on the go at the same time. Either they were working with graduate students writing, or they were engaged with their own writing, or they were peer reviewing, co-editors writing, co-authors writing. And so again, this talks to a great deal of flexibility in terms of writing. One of the things that is clear from all this is that all scientists, when they become senior scientists, become teachers of writing, because their job becomes to train the next generation. But they are totally, almost totally, ill-equipped to do this. They lack a language for doing this. Also, as they go out into writing in more cross-disciplinary and public-focused writing, they are again not trained to do this and do not have a language with which to think about it. So each time they engage with writing, these scientists are recreating the wheel, if you want to put it that way. They're all having to learn on their own. All right, so the most successful scientists write in a wide range of genre. 80% of the senior scientists that I interviewed were adaptive expert writers. And what I mean by that is they're writing in a wide range of genres. And their broadening focus of writing related to their views of the aims of science. So what I can say is that this 80% who were engaged in adaptive writing tasks had different views about the purpose of science to those who were routine experts. For some, the broadening focus was part of a political and economic imperative, and all had made this conscious shift to wider audiences. So they had decided that because of what they believed about science, that they had a responsibility to write more broadly. So here's one scientist speaking about this. I'll give you a moment to think about it. So this person was writing books about science that he really wanted to reach a wider population. And here he is again. The reason why communication is so vital is that science has to project its value to society at large. It has to engage with the public who have legitimate concerns about the use of science and legitimate anxieties about ethical issues. We have to communicate the beauty and the passion around the subject and get people excited so that they see that science is a wonderful thing. Other people were motivated by a desire for thought leadership. So I won't get you to read all of this, but they wanted people to be thinking about the role of science in terms of developing the economy. Most successful scientists are positively disposed towards writing, and here are a few quotes from a range of scientists. The word that came out most often in relation to writing was fun, which really surprised me. So I would say, why did you decide to write this popular book about nuclear physics? Which, you know, doesn't sound like a fun thing to do. And they would say, because it was such a fun challenge. And I'd say, really? Yeah, it was hard, but it was really fun. You know, one of the things I notice about scientists is that they like hard things. And writing something new is a hard thing that they like to do. For most of them, and again, I don't know if I've got time for you to read all this, they see writing as part of science. So don't read all of that. Let me talk about it. One of the views that the literature suggests is that scientists think that you do the science and then you write it up. But the successful scientists that I interviewed, the very successful ones, saw writing as part of science. So what they said was, as I write, I am learning and thinking of new ideas. And attitudes and practice go together. So one of the things this young scientist said was that the people who were really serious about science were also keen on writing. So this person's talking about master's students, and he's saying he can notice at that stage that the master's students who didn't like to write were also not good scientists. Right? So practice and attitudes go together. There were, however, some scientists who hated writing. Not just disliked it, hated it. So this particular person said, I don't actually enjoy the mechanics of writing, it's the product. And this person said he would avoid writing at all costs if possible. And this is an interesting perspective he has. Words aren't important in science or in engineering. So, of course, scientists and mathematicians and engineers think without words. And if you ask why use the words, it's like using prepositions in writing. Why do you use prepositions and things linking words that intrinsically have no meaning? The words, if you like, are the prepositions between the figures. Now, that was a really radical physicist. And I tried this out on almost everybody I interviewed after him, and they all went, what? But for this person, the equations and the figures were the only things that mattered. And he claimed that he could read a paper in Spanish or Swedish, neither of which were languages that he knew if it was in his field, because he didn't need the words. So an interesting person to follow up on. So these scientists, but those who hate to write, what I found was that they had strategies to overcome it. So what they did was they either found themselves some peers, some co-authors who were good writers and let them do the writing, or some of them actually developed teams of graduate students or doctoral students who postgrads who were good writers and relied on them, or they developed a very narrow range of writing tasks. I will write for 3 journals only, and I will write 3 papers for them every year. And so they could find a way of being a successful writer, but it was harder for them. It was much harder for them, and they were much more likely to be narrowly focused. I want to show you a quote from somebody who moved me deeply. So this was somebody who, as a child, couldn't write at all. He identified himself as Asperger's, and he said, it was funny, the first hour of the interview, he was this very successful mathematician, very high-ranking, very successful, called on by government to do all sorts of things, had published all these books and all these papers. And for an hour, we talked about him as a successful writer. And then I asked him about his childhood, and everything changed. So this is what he said. What's interesting is I did mathematics, I think, because I found English so difficult. I was top in maths, but I was desperate in English. I remember this essay, the title was Your House. Now, as a mathematician, and I come back to this autism and Asperger's thing, I've got to write about my house. What is my house? And I went to numbers straight away. I've got 5 windows. It's got 1 door. This is at the age of 10 or 11. I knew it was a disaster when I wrote it, but I was incapable of doing anything better. I had imagination in maths, but no imagination in writing. Now, the interesting thing about this person was that he said to me at the end of the interview, I am so glad I have had a career that requires me to be a writer. And he had drawn on the help of what sounded like a formidable mother, some amazing teachers, a wonderful doctoral supervisor, and wonderful colleagues who had, in effect, taught him to write. And he still found it hard, but he had found a way. He wasn't like the other person that I showed you before who hated writing. He had found successful strategies to become an effective writer. Right. The next point is that process means something different in science, as I suspected. There are issues that are different if we're teaching science writing process. Now, I've got lots of quotes up here, but we're not going to have time for them, so I will talk you through them. First of all, look at the heading. Scientists write backwards. They all told me this. I write backwards. And they told it me like it was a magic secret that they had found all by themselves. The more accurate thing is to say that they start in the middle and they work outwards when they're writing. So they don't start writing the introduction and then the methodology and then the results. They start at the results. And they start with, what is the story here? What is the story here? And they start writing the story that they can see, and gradually they move out into the other parts of the writing. So when we think about teaching writing, we've got to think about teaching things other than linearly. They focus on story. This was their other secret weapon that all of them had discovered by themselves and told it to me as if it was a magic secret. They had discovered that story was a center of science writing, and they would look at this data and they would say, where's the story? How can I find the story? What is the narrative here? Interestingly, when you push them, well, what do you mean by story? They had trouble explaining what they meant. But it was looking for themes, looking for ideas which came out of their data. And the other thing that was important about story was that figures and equations are seen as compressed writing and are central to story. Now, I don't know about you if you are a writing teacher, but often as writing teachers, we avoid figures and graphs because we like writing. But we can't, as teachers of science writing, avoid these because these are part of the story. They are central to the story. I'm going to move on. Here's the thing to surprise you. Audience doesn't always matter. I would say, do you think about your audience when you're writing? And a lot of them would say, no. And I'd say, well, who are you writing for? And they'd say, me. Or people like me. All right? They were writing to people who thought the same way as they did. And so they didn't have to think about audience because their audience was themselves, really. But the most successful scientists, the ones who engage in a wide range of writing activities, can think creatively about audience. And I won't get you through these because I want to move on. I'll make sure my slides are available if you want to look at these. Writing often involves managing complex hierarchical relationships. So when we do peer support, for example, as writing teachers, we tend to do peers. But in science writing, writing is almost always hierarchical. And I have yet to find an answer for how we're going to engage in that hierarchical form of writing in the classroom. The major problem that I identified in my research is the learning environment. So as I said at the beginning, and this was hypothesized through the literature and through my own informal observations, but it came out again and again in the literature, the learning environment in which scientists learn to write does not provide scientists with a language for writing. And we need to find a way to do that. We absolutely do need to find a way to do that. At the end of Mick's speech this morning, his last slide used the phrase, a learning community. And I felt that at the end, this was at the heart of how we need to engage as teachers of scientific writing, the learning environment. None of my scientists had developed as writers within a learning community that discussed writing. They did learn in a learning community, but that learning community did not discuss writing. Instead, the most significant influence on their writing was a single person who had some ability to articulate their writing choices. And this was absolutely hit and miss. So the saddest people that I interviewed were the people who had gone through science without a support network. And the most sustained influence was reading and imitation. So we need to start modeling a learning community that talks about writing. And here is Barita and Skardamalia's definition of learning community. They generate questions and investigate methods. They engage with the why as well as the how questions. Tasks are not always predictable. The goal of discussion is not always consensus. And the leader is a co-learner. And there are multiple strategies for managing knowledge gaps. As I was going through these slides again this afternoon, thinking about it, I was going back to Mick's idea around student engagement and thinking if we could engage our scientific communities in writing within the hierarchical context so that they were all co-learners, our situation would change dramatically. So, writing must become an essential element of any science curriculum. We need to change attitudes and beliefs, not just practice. We must teach process over product, and our approach to process must be authentic. So if we're going to teach writing, we need to find authentic processes with which to do this. One of the things I want to suggest is that perhaps we need to start working across the disciplines more. We need to find a language to talk about rhetorical context so that our students are as flexible and articulate about writing as we can make them. But I think that unless we start working with the scientific community, we cannot teach writing effectively. I think we need to do it for our students so that they are motivated and we are credible as teachers. But I also think we need to do it for ourselves. C.P. Snow talked many years ago about the divide between the arts and sciences. In all my research and experience in working in this field, I would say that divide still exists between us as teachers and between us as researchers. For our students, we need to come together and we need to be having conversations between the different disciplines, but we also need to do it for ourselves. We have a lot to learn from one another as teachers. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you.